your heads out today, I may be wrong, but what I imagine is that you are primarily focused on your lab practical and you spend a lot of intense time. So we're going to start on the nervous system today. Here's what I will do for you. You are not going to be quizzed until after everybody's finished with their lab practical, okay? But I need to tell you a little bit about the nervous system because I need you to know that when you start studying, you're going to have to study deeply and frequently because the nervous system, absolutely fascinating, really complex. There are 6 chapters about it in your textbook, and none of the terminology is usually familiar to people, which means that you have to get over the terminology hump before you can even put the names together with the structures. So what I'm going to tell you is today I'm going to sort of try to lay out the big picture of the nervous system, and I'm going to need you to start studying. I'm not a fool. I know that it probably won't happen until after your lab practical. But then after that, the first quiz that you have after your lab practical is going to be a beast. So I want you to study very deeply as soon as you are able, okay? And the reason I'm going to do that is because the whole rest of the nervous system really depends on you getting the terminology out of the way. I can't teach you any of the complexity of the structures without you knowing what I mean by that noun, right? So that's what we're going to try to do today. Feel free to ask questions if you want to. This is usually people's hardest bit of information. But it's usually really interesting, and so if it's going to be hard, at least it can be interesting. And it's my favorite. Not because it's hard, just because I love the nervous system. So hopefully with the hard, I will communicate some enthusiasm and some interest to you. I will at least attempt to do so, okay? So we're going to start with the fundamentals of the nervous system and nervous tissue. There are 6 chapters in the nervous system in your textbook. From my perspective, my opinion, why is there so much in there about the nervous system? I think because it's so complex, they don't really know what to leave out, right? So there's so much that's known and there's so much that's not known that it's really hard to figure out what is not important. So what do you have to know? Well, you have to know what I present to you in the notes or anything that I refer to in the notes. So I have narrowed it for you, but the stuff in the notes, you have to know all of it, right? Okay, but only that, right? And if I tell you something that you need to go read, then you have to know that. So there's 3 sets of nervous system notes. Only the first one's up because I'm revising the other 2 because I found out some new interesting ways to talk about the structure of the brain, so I'm redoing that. But anything that's not directly referred to is not something I expect you to go, because you could, I mean, really, you can spend an entire career studying the nervous system. So, big picture understanding before we get any further. What is the nervous system doing for you? To simplify it, it's primarily doing 3 things. And the 3 things are these: information in, that's sensation; process the information, which is like, what is the point of gathering sensory information if you don't ever assess it, right? What is the point of putting light into your eye holes if you don't ever use it, right, to figure out what you're looking at? So the information processing is called integration. And then the response, and the response is sending information out. So here's an example for you. Hand on a hot stove. The nervous system is going to take care of that via a 3-step process. And the first step is sending information in via sensation, right? And the information goes in, but that doesn't solve the problem. Do you agree? Sending the information in doesn't solve the problem. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even identify the problem. So what happens is the sensation is sending information in, but then primarily in the brain and the spinal cord, what the brain and the spinal cord does is integration. And it's a couple of different things. It says hot, identification, right? Assessment, too hot, too damn hot. Um, and it's basically comparing actual to ideal. And then what do you want to do about it? Figure out what needs to be done about it, right? And all of that has to happen in the integration phase before you send the information out, which is actually the motor response to make you move your hand, right? So do you think it's 3 steps: sensation, integration, motor response? Yeah? Okay, so that is like a big picture of what your nervous system is trying to accomplish for you. Primarily, it's doing that to try to keep you homeostatic and alive, right? And just so you know, you're gathering far more senses than you could ever possibly be aware of. You right now are assessing your own blood pH and sending that information to the brain for integration. You are assessing your blood pressure. You are monitoring the stretch of your urinary bladder. So the vast majority of sensations, interestingly enough, you are never made consciously aware of. As a matter of fact, the sensations that you will be aware of are the ones that go to the most superficial portion of your brain. If they end up in the most superficial portion of your brain, called your cerebral cortex, you will become potentially aware of them. If they end up anywhere else, you are not aware of them at all. So you're aware of like the smallest fraction of the things that your body is actually doing. And as far as responses go, fascinatingly, your brain commands responses, but you're only actually in control voluntarily of a single tissue in your entire body, and that is your skeletal muscle. And only if the command comes from the cerebral cortex. So you are not in voluntary control of the vast majority. So it's humbling to think about how much sensation you're not consciously aware of and how much activity you're not in voluntary control of. And so we'll sort of revisit that as we're going through. So what we're going to do today is first get a little bit of the structural organization of the nervous system, and then get a little bit of functional organization, and then try to put them back together. And so the first is not a very hard place to start. We're going to start with just the general structural organization of the nervous system. And this is something that you've heard before, I'm pretty sure. The central nervous system is exclusively two structures. It is exclusively the brain and the spinal cord. That is all the central nervous system. Any other nervous tissue in the entire body is considered part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, why do you care? The reason you care is because it is clinically important, because the central nervous system is doing the processing, right, the decision making, and the peripheral nervous system is not. And then it's clinically important because they have two very different capacities for healing and regeneration. With very few exceptions, the central nervous system, the cells are amitotic and non-regenerative. So if you damage it, it is permanent damage. So for instance, if you damage your spinal cord, in all likelihood that is permanent damage, right? But with the peripheral nervous system, it's clinically different, because if, for instance, I damage this nerve right here in the peripheral nervous system, I can't guarantee that I'm going to get regeneration, but the probability is not zero, right? And so that's very clinically significant, right? Nerve damage is very different than spinal cord damage or brain damage, right? Okay, so keep that in mind. So the CNS and the PNS is what we generally refer to them: central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So with the central nervous system, mostly what you're going to see in the central nervous system is a whole bunch of neurons, a whole bunch of cell bodies, and then some wiring between them. And wiring is primarily going to be axons and dendrites between them. So before we go into those structures, you know this already. The brain is located in what body cavity? Cranial. And the spinal cord is located in the spinal or vertebral. Either one's correct, right? And you knew that. So what I want to do is I want to like take a little chunk of brain tissue and look at what you would find in there histologically, right? It's going to be variable between the parts of your brain, but there's going to be some general truths to it. So first thing, one of the big challenges, and it may just be my limitation, I don't know. One of the big challenges with the nervous system is that the brain, for instance, it doesn't have a whole lot of really distinct boundaries in it. So for instance, if we're talking about cerebral cortex function and we say that this part does this, but move over 4 millimeters and this part does something entirely different, it's not a different color. It doesn't have like a distinct boundary. In addition, a lot of the brain structures are deep within the brain, and so you look at a 2D structure, but you have to figure out where it is three-dimensionally. And some of you guys are amazing at that, but I'm terrible at it. So if I am redundant and repetitive about making you look at an image of the brain and figure out what you're looking at, that's why. Because people don't tend to be very good at that, and I am like one of the worst ones. So before we look at what the tissue is actually going to be, I want you to look at this section and tell me what kind of section through the brain that is. What do you think? Yeah, it's a coronal section through the brain. And you may or may not know this, you probably don't yet, but it's a coronal section that's about like right here. Like if you had a middle, right? Because it goes almost through the medulla oblongata, just like almost. So it's about right there. Okay, so just keep that in mind for just a second. And before we get into details, I want you to look at the general pattern that you're seeing there. You have heard before of gray matter and white matter, correct? Yeah? And so what it really is dark and light matter that you have in the brain. And the gray matter, the general pattern tends to be gray matter on the outside. You guys with me? White matter deep to that. And then some more chunks of gray matter deep to the white matter. Is that okay? Okay, so now with that in mind, I want to look at what the gray matter is generally made of and what the white matter is generally made of. Okay, so what you're looking at here is, watch, do you see? They're going to take a little chunk of mostly gray matter right here. It's at least darker than the white matter. And they're going to blow it up, and you're going to see what you're looking at, okay? And this chunk, please note, is also bordering on an open space in the brain. I don't know if you guys know this, but your brain is hollow. There are spaces within your brain called ventricles, and they're filled with fluid. So this is showing you the edge of one of the ventricles as well, and we'll come back to that and revisit it several times. Okay, so we're going to take a picture of grayish matter, and we're going to look at it and say, what is it actually composed of? The gray matter of the brain is primarily composed of neurons, yeah? Okay, and those, of course, are your electrically excitable cells that release neurotransmitters and are responsible primarily for most of the functionality of the brain. They're the ones that get all the attention. But please note that there are also cells that are not neurons in here, and these are your glial cells or neuroglial cells. And the neuroglial cells are really the support staff for the neurons, okay? So when you're looking at gray matter, what I'm telling you is that you're primarily looking at neurons and their support staff, the actual cell bodies of the neurons. But stick with me for a second. Please note that there's gray matter here and there's gray matter here, yeah? What if I wanted to communicate between the gray matter on the right cerebral cortex and the left cerebral cortex? What I need is wiring to communicate between the cells. So I want you to think of the cells as the processors, decision makers, maybe not conscious, but decision makers, right? But then this one makes different decisions than this one, and they need to communicate with one another. So what the white matter is, guys, is a whole bunch of wiring. This is my favorite dissection. So now I'm going to look at a dorsal view of the brain, okay? And do you see the gray matter at the edge here and the gray matter at the edge here? And what you have is the white matter is actually the wiring that communicates between the gray matter in your brain. Does that make sense? Okay. So the white matter is not actually cells. It's the processes coming and going from cells, axons and dendrites. That makes sense? It's a part of the cell. That makes sense? So now, this is like a beautiful dissection. I totally want to do this one. I've never tried to do this dissection. I just found this image before. Because usually how they this structure, by the way, is the biggest communicating structure between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. And you're going to learn it after the lab practical. It's called the corpus callosum. Okay? So the corpus callosum communicates between the left and the right sides. But when you learn it in lab, you usually learn it as a structure that really doesn't show you what it is, because you usually learn it as a structure that looks like this, which is just a cross-section of all those cables, right, going between the left and the right sides. Does that make sense? It's not quite as indicative of what you're looking at. Or right here, this is a coronal section, and you're looking at the same structure in a coronal section, right? But what I'm telling you is all of this white matter that you're seeing is a bunch of cabling running between gray matter. And it's not all going left to right. Some of it's going anterior to posterior, and some of it's going up and down, but it's all that wiring, okay? So going back to this figure, this coronal section, now you can see that the brain is really a mix of processors and the wiring between processors, right? Okay, and you could impact potentially the functionality of the brain if you either impacted the processors or the communication between the processors. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's like a big picture understanding of the gray matter and white matter of the brain. Okay, so what do you call it? The electrically excitable areas with the neurons and neuroglial cell bodies is called gray matter. And what you call the white matter in the brain is tracks or pathways. So if you have white matter going within the brain, it's called a tract or a pathway. Okay, so for instance, you would say for instance, the corpus callosum is the largest tract in the brain. Yeah? But, stick with me for a second. What's happening out here in the peripheral nervous system, the peripheral nervous system is almost exclusively wiring. Does that make sense? It's wiring to muscles to tell them what to do, or it's wiring from sensory receptors to get the information in. So it's almost all wiring. So what I'm saying is, let's look at this figure again, this one right here. So what this is it's kind of white. Do you see that it's kind of white? Okay. If I took a cross section of that thing called a nerve, yeah, and looked at the cross section of it, it would also be white, okay? But it's white matter plus connective tissue, because think about this. If I'm within the brain, there's tremendous capacity for protection. There's a cranium, the cerebrospinal fluid, and 3 layers of protection around it. You don't have connective tissue in the inside of the brain. You've just got this wiring, okay? But if I'm running to my thumb or to my leg, I need both the wires, the axons, and the axons, but I also need connective tissue protection around it. Does that make sense? So a nerve and a tract are different from one another in that way. They're both going to be white tissue, but within the brain it's just white tissue. It's just nervous tissue, right? But outside of the brain it's nervous tissue that's protected. Is that okay? So before we get into the actual structures of the nerve, I'll talk about them just briefly in just a second. Does it make sense to you that as far as where you would theoretically want your neurons that are mostly amitotic, neurons don't do much regeneration at all, wouldn't you want them sort of sequestered in the central nervous system, protected by bone, protected by cerebrospinal fluid, protected by meninges like the dura mater? So the vast majority of the central nervous system is all of the cells that are protected in the cell bodies. Because if you kill off the cell body, it's out, right? But if you kill off an axon, you might be able to grow one back if the cell body is still alive, right? Okay, so what you're seeing with the nerve is this is a cross section of the nerve, okay? So stick with me, I'm going to put this together for you. So this nerve doesn't have cell bodies in it, right? It's just wiring, and the cell bodies are either up there or down there, right? Okay, so I want to show you how this thing is sort of put together. A nerve is a bundle of axons that's protected with connective tissue, but it's got layer after layer of protection. So here's an axon. So I want you to imagine that the neuron cell body associated with that axon is up there in the brain, okay? It's not here in the nerve. And then the axon is running through. Yeah, the axon's going to be protected with a myelin sheath, which we'll talk about later. But then in addition to the myelin sheath, it has layers of connective tissue protecting it. The one that is closest to the axon is called the endoneurium. It's going to sound familiar here. And then if you bundle up a whole bunch of axons into a bundle of axons called a fascicle, you're going to wrap that with perineurium. Is that okay? If you bundle all of the fascicles together, it's a nerve, and you wrap the whole thing with epineurium. Okay? It's consistent and parallel to what you learned about muscles. Is that good? Okay, so we're going to come back to this in just a minute. Each axon in the nerve is behaving independently of the other axons. So for instance, this one right here might be carrying information from the brain to my muscle to make it do this, right? But its neighbor right here might be carrying information about sensation from the palm of my hand up to my brain, okay? So if I cut, let's talk about this. If, for instance, if I cut this branch off of the radial nerve, if I cut the radial nerve right there, completely transected the radial nerve, I could lose the capacity to feel this and do this, right? Because the axons that are running through that, some of them are carrying sensory information in, some of them are carrying motor information out. So with nerve damage, especially in the peripheral, you can lose both sensory and motor capacity with a single nerve damage. That makes sense to you? Okay. All right. So a nerve and a tract are similar, right, in functionality, but they're different because one is CNS and one is PNS, and one includes connective tissue and the other one doesn't. Go ahead. Yes. Yeah, so the longest axons in your body, not very impressive in me, it would be more impressive in you and the people who are taller than me, is the longest axons in your body run from the neuron cell body of the axons that go to my little toe are up here in the lumbar region of my spinal cord. That's where the neuron cell body is. And the axon runs through the nerve all the way down to my little toe. And it's just wiring. Peripheral is just axon? Just axon. I mean, there's a little teeny exception that we'll come to, but yes, with very few exceptions. Does that make sense? So it's just wiring that you have there. So all of this is just like cables and cables and cables of wires. So I'll show you what the histology actually looks like. If you take this and actually look at the histology, look at the top picture. This is the cross section through a nerve. Do you see this is a fascicle with a whole bunch of little individual axons in it? There are blood vessels that run through there as well, just because like you're on your way there anyway. So you can see that cross section of a nerve. It's kind of cool. Okay, so you understand the concept? Nerves. Okay, so the neuron, so back to the central nervous system for a second. When you're looking at the central nervous system, you have gray matter and white matter, and the gray matter is the cell bodies primarily, and the white matter is the wiring between them. So I'm going to tell you that every single sensation that you have, every single one, has to come to the central nervous system for integration. And remember, integration is so what, right? How much? What do you want to do about it? Is it significant to me? So every single sensation that you have comes to the central nervous system for integration, but you're only aware of the ones that actually go specifically to the cerebral cortex. If it goes to your medulla oblongata, you have no awareness of it, but it doesn't mean you're not monitoring your blood pressure. You are. It's just that basically it's taking care of it for you behind the scenes, right? So you're really only aware of the things that go to the most superficial portion of your brain. So your entire awareness is in about 4 millimeters on the surface of your brain. It's your entire awareness of anything related to your experience. And every single motor command comes from your brain. But the vast majority of them are not voluntary, right? So for instance, I can control the rate at which my heart beats, but not voluntarily. I can't do it. It comes, the only ones that you're in voluntary control of come again from that most superficial portion of your brain, the cerebral cortex. So fascinatingly, your cerebral cortex is every single thing that you have ever identified as you is 4 millimeters on the surface of your brain, right? It's like every conscious thought you've ever had, every voluntary activity that you've ever done is just there. And so if you damage your cerebral cortex, interestingly, can you still stay alive? Like if somebody will stick a feeding tube in you, can you still stay alive? Yes, physiologically you can stay alive, but will you have anything approaching a human experience? No, you won't have anything approaching a human experience. Does that make sense to you? So, and we're going to talk about the brain a lot when we get to the next set of notes. So it's just the intro to the brain. Okay, so with the peripheral nervous system, all of the other nervous tissue in the body that is not brain or spinal cord is considered PNS, or peripheral nervous system. And of course, you know, conceptually it should make sense to you why it's called peripheral, right? Because where's your peripheral vision? Sides, right? So that's why it's called the peripheral nervous system. And yes, his question was this. The vast majority of it is just nerves, which is just wiring and no actual cell bodies. But there are little lumps right next to your spinal cord and a couple other places which are called ganglia. And the ganglia are little small collections of neurons. It's way, way less than 1% of your neuron cell bodies are in the peripheral nervous system, but there are a few. And we'll talk about their functionality a little bit later. They're obviously slightly more likely to be damaged than the central nervous system. But in addition, they're also slightly less likely to keep you alive. I mean, they're not like involved in vital physiological processes. So those are called ganglia, and we'll come back to those. Okay. So we did epineurium, endoneurium, perineurium. So now let's talk about nerves as a big picture. So you are going to learn some nerves, but remember that every single nerve actually has to attach to the central nervous system. Otherwise, there's really no point in having it, right? Okay, so the metaphor that you can use is that this is I-15, right? And there are a limited numbers of on-ramps and off-ramps to I-15. But even if you live in a farm, on a farm in Roy, your driveway has to be able to get all the way back to I-15 ultimately. Does that make sense? Okay, so what happens is there are a limited number of on-ramps and off-ramps to the central nervous system. And so there are 12 that are directly attached, 12 pairs, sorry, that are directly attached to the brain. Those are going to be called cranial nerves. Okay? You're going to learn them the week after the lab practical. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they are numbered Roman numerals 1 through 12. In addition, they also have names that's based on either their function or their location. Like, for instance, the optic nerve. You can probably figure out what that one does, right? Vision. Or sometimes they're related. They're like the hypoglossal nerve because it goes under your tongue. Okay? So there's going to be 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and you'll learn locations and general structure functions of those. But let me give you a big picture understanding of what the cranial nerves kind of do, an intro to them. The cranial nerves mostly do head stuff. They mostly do sensory and motor stuff associated with your head. The optic nerve is vision, right? The vestibulocochlear nerve is hearing and equilibrium. You've got a facial nerve, which does both sensation in the face and also controls the muscular activity of your facial muscles. That makes sense? So mostly the cranial nerves do head stuff, with the exception of one really important one. This really important one is cranial nerve number 10, called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is called vagus because it means like vagrant, it's a wanderer. That one forgot that it's supposed to do head stuff because it actually wanders down and innervates the heart and the abdominal pelvic cavity. But mostly cranial nerves do head stuff. Okay, so what do spinal nerves do? The spinal nerves are actually going to do. This is going to be, well, first of all, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And they don't have individual names. They just have names based on where they leave the spinal cord and which vertebra they leave by. So what you have is you have a set of cervical spinal nerves. Yes? You have a set of thoracic spinal nerves. You have a set of lumbar spinal nerves. And you only have one coccygeal spinal nerve, just because of these. Okay. And so you're going to learn this again later, but I'll mention it to you for the first time. These that come from the cervical region are named C1 through C8. You have 8 just because the first one actually started below the foramen magnum instead of below C1. So you end up with one extra one. That makes sense? Okay. So, and then you have T1 through T12 spinal nerves, right? L1 through L5 spinal nerves. And then one coccygeal spinal nerve. Does that make sense? So let's talk briefly about what these do, and then we can briefly talk about spinal cord injuries. So this is a good general rule. There are exceptions to it. That's a good way to get started. The nerves that are leaving here, right here, innervate regions that are just inferior to them. Okay? So the cervical spinal nerves, look, follow them out. They're going to innervate my neck, but also my arms. Yeah? Make sense? And then both sensory and motor activity. Okay? And then these guys right here are going to innervate just below. Like, for instance, does it surprise you at all that branches off of these thoracic spinal nerves will innervate the intercostal muscles? Does that surprise you? That makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. And then actually, after you move down below there, the ones that come out here, spinal cord ends right here, but the nerves are actually labeled for where they leave, not for where they originate. That's why even though the spinal cord ends about L1, I have spinal nerves all the way to coccygeal nerve number 1. I have L1 through L5 because they're named for where they leave. Okay, so these guys right here, if you follow them, you can see that they innervate your pelvis and your junk, and they innervate your legs, right? So the ones that leave here innervate your legs. So let's talk about that with reference to spinal cord injuries for a second, because this can help you understand why a high spinal cord injury is way worse than a low spinal cord injury. And you've known that it was, of course, but this just gives you structure, function, relationships. So if I damage my spinal cord right here, then if I completely transect it, then can you see that even if I was trying to get motor information out from the brain to the legs, it can't go. I've lost my wiring, right? I've disconnected my wiring. Likewise, if I'm trying to get sensory innervation up from my legs or my toes or my penis, I can't feel that, right? Because it can't get up there because I've transected it. But if I damage it a little higher, I lose more functionality. If I damage it really high, I become, instead of a paraplegic, I become a quadriplegic. Does that make sense? I lose not only sensation and motor activity in my lower limbs, but also in my upper limbs. Okay? And if you damage it all the way up to here and you damage the nerves that actually innervate your diaphragm come out way higher than you would think they do. They come out about C3, C2, right, way up there. If you damage like right by the brainstem, then you're going to die, right? In all likelihood, if you completely transect it right by the brainstem, because you can't control your respiration. Okay, but mostly the region that comes out innervates just below it. A couple of exceptions, and the exceptions are important. I mean, have any questions? You guys okay? Okay. All right. So now, these are not all the nerves in your body because you have to make it all the way onto that little driveway in Roy. These are the major nerves in your body, but there are tons and tons of branches off of those that are not drawn in this picture. Oh, I have a good picture. I'll show you. Hold on just a second. Oh. This is the human nervous system dissected out with a lot more of the nerves. Isn't that cool? Freaking love that thing. So yeah, that's the nervous system dissected out. That's not even all of them. So for instance, let's imagine that you were like a plastic surgeon doing reconstructive facial surgery. You don't just have to know that the facial nerve innervates right here. You have to know all of the branches because, for instance, this one may innervate the orbicularis oris around the eye, this branch, but this branch actually innervates your risorius or your zygomatic major or zygomatic minor. And if you are working on trying to get symmetry in the face, then you need to make sure that you actually don't damage the nerves when you're doing whatever you're doing. That makes sense? There's all kinds of teeny tiny little branches on them. Okay, all right. So now briefly, what are nerves doing? So if you look at any nerve, okay, you can look at a nerve, and if you look at the cross-section of the nerve, you can identify the nerve functionally by saying, are all of the axons in that nerve carrying information toward the central nervous system? Then the nerve is a sensory nerve, because that's all it's doing, okay? Classic example of a sensory nerve is this guy right here. The optic nerve is freaking busy, man. There's like a whole bunch of sensory information that needs to be carried to the brain. It is exclusively sensory, right? That's all it's doing is carrying information toward the brain. Every single axon in it. But I mean, we have to move our eyeballs too, right? So there has to be motor control of the eye. That's a different nerve called the oculomotor nerve, and it's exclusively motor. Does that make sense? Okay, because every single axon in it is carrying information out. But how about this guy right here? How about the radial nerve? Branches off of the radial nerve. Well, the radial nerve is heading out there to your hand, and you have a couple of different meats on that side. You need to be able to feel what's going on in your hand, but you also need to be able to, for instance, control this activity, right? So almost all the peripheral nerves, almost all of the spinal nerves are mixed in function. That means that some of the axons are carrying information out motor, and other axons are carrying information in. That makes sense? Most nerves in the body are mixed in function. There's a few sensory, a few motor, and most of them are mixed in function. Is that okay? Okay, all right. You guys are very quiet today. Are you really okay? Yeah. I know, the nervous system is a lot. It really is. I let the other class go a couple minutes early because they were like glazed. Like, oh, okay. I can tell we've reached saturation. So I'll see you guys Monday. Okay, not yet though. Okay, so the last thing I want to get through is terminology associated with the nervous system. Well, no, almost the last thing I want to get to. So we just put together the basic structure function, right? What to expect to find generally here and here. What is a nerve? What's the gray matter? What's the white matter? What's it doing? But now what we need to do is we need to talk about the functional organization of the nervous system. So we're going to start learning function words so that we can use them later. Okay, so this is the figure that your textbook uses, but I'm going to rebuild it because I want you to like see the building process. So what we are going to say is we're going to try to understand structure-function relationships in the nervous system. But most people's problem with the nervous system is that they do not take the time to understand what the nouns mean and the adjectives mean. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. Like, what are these things mean? So I'm going to ask you some concepts, and I want you to tell me if you get confused about what we're talking about. Okay, so first, just conceptually, we're talking about functionality of the nervous system. And so this is the CNS, and this is the PNS. And my first question to you is there one-way or two-way communication between the CNS and the PNS? Two-way communication. Do you agree? Two-way? Okay, so I'm going to draw two arrows, and then I'm going to ask you a question. One of those arrows I could conceptually label sensory. Which one? Top or bottom? Top, yes. Carrying information from the peripheral nervous system. Does that make sense? Okay. And the other one I could label motor, right, as far as activity goes. Yes? Okay. So let's put this back together with a hand on a hot stove example before we add more vocabulary to it. That means that if I put my hand on a hot stove, the information comes through the peripheral nervous system, right? Specifically through the sensory division. And then it's going to go to the central nervous system where you are going to do integration, remember? And the integration is hot, how hot, too damn hot, yeah? And then the motor information is going to come back out the peripheral nervous system and go, for instance, to my skeletal muscle to make me move my hand. Does that make sense? Okay, so now what we're going to start doing is we're going to start dividing the functionality of the peripheral nervous system, because you see that the peripheral nervous system is really not going to do any appreciable amount of integration. What it's going to be doing is pretty much just sensation or motor activity. Do you see that? The integration, with very few exceptions, goes on in the central nervous system. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to divide out and start talking about types of sensations, types of motor activity that are controlled with the peripheral nervous system. You with me? Okay. So now the peripheral nervous system, the first big division is, I'm going to draw it something different than they do. Let's say you're going to note the arrows. Okay. We're going to divide the peripheral nervous system by functionality, and we are going to say that one side of the functionality of the peripheral nervous system is sensation, and the other one is motor activity. But there are new words for them. So this branch is called sensory or afferent. This word will be used so often in your future that you need to learn it. Okay? So it's another word for sensory. Okay? And the other side is going to be carrying information away, and ultimately it's going to be motor or efferent. Now, I have to tell you that I'm pronouncing those incorrectly, but I'm doing it because it's hard to hear the difference between them if you pronounce them correctly. Because it's actually afferent and efferent. But I'm going to Texasize them so you can tell what I'm talking about. So I'm going to say afferent and efferent. But when you talk to your most respected professor in 5 years, you're not going to say it that way, right? You're going to say Melly ruins me. It's all her fault. Okay. Okay. So we're going to go to the sensory side, and we're going to wire it up to sensory receptors, because that's what it would be, right? So ultimately, you are going to have sensory receptors that are going to be wired up to the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. So let's briefly talk about sensory receptors for just a second before we have any more detail to that. Sensory receptors, you know, you've met them before. You have touch, temperature, pressure, pain receptors, you have stretch receptors, you have all different kinds of sensory receptors. And then you also have your like special sensory receptors, vision, hearing, taste, and those kinds of things. So those are all sensory receptors, and they all have to be wired up to the central nervous system, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to divide the types of sensation based on sort of where the sensory receptors are, sort of what they're doing. So we're going to call the first set somatic sensory. Okay. So you have sensory receptors that are considered somatic sensory. And soma means body. Okay. So the somatic sensations are the ones that come from your skin, your muscles, and your bones primarily, and surface stuff. Right? So this right here is a somatic sensation. When I put my hand on a hot stove and burn it, it's a somatic sensation. When I crack my shin in the middle of the night on the coffee table, that's a somatic sensation. Does that make sense? So somatic is skin, muscles, and bone. It also includes most of the special senses, even though that doesn't quite make sense. It includes everything that tastes too. So somatic sensory, but just think skin, muscles, and bones for a second. And there's another type of sensation. And the other type of sensation is called visceral. Okay, so visceral means guts, right? And these are the senses that are going on in your guts, whether you're conscious or not conscious of them. And so if you want to think about the difference, cracking your shin on the coffee table in the middle of the night is a somatic sensation. But having abdominal pains because you've got diarrhea, that's a visceral sensation, right? So I'll tell you a couple of them and you categorize them, okay? So spider walking across your skin. Uterine cramping. Visceral, exactly. Detecting how full your urinary bladder is. Visceral sensation, exactly. Muscle pain because you worked out. Somatic. So do you see? Okay. So there's different kinds of sensations based on where they occur. Generally speaking, there are exceptions. Generally speaking, these will speak to the conscious portion of your brain, and these sometimes do. Not like you can't tell right now that your urinary bladder is detecting stretch. You will be able to if it gets so full you're about to pee down your leg, right? It'll start telling the conscious portions of you to go pee, but you're not always aware of those. Sometimes you are not. But so does this make sense to you guys? Got it? Okay, so now this part is more complicated, and this part, the motor or efferent division, has two big subdivisions. But what it is going to do is, regardless of what you're going to do, remember with sensory, you always gather the information from sensory receptors, right? You just had to figure out where they were, right? You with me? With the motor, you always send information to what we call effectors. And the way that you think of the word effectors is things that you can effect change on, things that you can control the activity of, like muscle and glands. That makes sense? So you're going to wire them up ultimately to effectors. And we'll talk about the types of effectors in just a second. Okay, so this is going to have two big subdivisions. This first one is going to be called the somatic motor division. And it's going to go specifically to, it's going to go to one type of effector that you can control voluntarily, and that is what? Skeletal muscle, exactly. The somatic motor division controls skeletal muscle. This division is very often what people call the voluntary nervous system. But it's only kind of true, because does your skeletal muscle ever behave involuntarily? Yeah, it does. Try to hold your breath to death and see if your skeletal muscle will let you do it, right? The diaphragm will breathe for you if you were too dumb to breathe on your own, right? So it is voluntary with an asterisk, which means I will pull this car over if you misbehave and just take over myself, okay? So somatic motor division controls skeletal muscle. The other way to say that is that skeletal muscle is the effector of the somatic motor nervous system. That makes sense? Okay, and then the other branch, the other part of it is what we call the autonomic motor. Sometimes people also call it the visceral motor division. Okay, and this controls the other kind of effectors that are controllable. Not voluntarily, but they are controllable. What do you think? What's it going to control? What? Heart muscle. Smooth muscle and glandular secretion. Something is controlling those. Not doing it voluntarily, but it is being controlled. So the effectors are cardiac, smooth organs. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, obviously, that one's involuntary. You can't, for instance, decide that it's an inopportune time to have uterine pregnancy or to contract the smooth muscle of your digestive tract. Can't do that. Not in control of it. Okay, so I want to send a couple of examples through this before we add a little bit more detail. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples so that you can get used to using the words. Okay, so I'm going to send a hand on a hot stove through it first. Only this time you're going to give me more detail about what we're actually dealing with. Okay, so if I put my hand in a hot stove, where are the sensory receptors going to be? Are they going to be somatic sensory or visceral sensory? Somatic sensory division of the afferent nervous system, right? Which is part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, and then I'm going to send it to the central nervous system for integration. And then I'm going to respond by moving my hand, right? So let's get me back out to the right effector to solve the problem, okay? I'm going to go back out the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Only this time I'm going to go efferent instead of afferent, right? And which branch of the efferent will get me where I need to go? Somatic motor will get me to the proper effector, which is skeletal muscle. That makes sense? Okay, so now I'm going to do a different example. Now I'm going to eat the spiciest Thai food on earth, and I'm going to get the squirts because of it. Okay, that is what's going to happen here. Okay, because you know some of us think we can handle spicy Thai food, but we can't. Okay, it is not possible. Okay, not for me anyway. But I try every time, and I'm just like walking around outside the building. I totally did that the last time I ate at Shannon Thai. I was like, oh my God. Okay, so we are going to experience extremely irritating Thai food. And so where are those sensory receptors going to be? What kind are they? They're visceral sensory receptors, which is part of the afferent nervous system, right? And it's going to go through the PNS to the CNS for integration. And then it's going to send information back out to get that stuff out of your digestive system. It's going to go back out through the peripheral nervous system. But this time, which ferent we're going to do? We're going to do efferent. And specifically to get to the smooth muscle in my intestines, I'm going to go which branch to get? I'm going to do autonomic motor to stimulate my smooth muscle. Does that make sense? Okay, so can you see that it takes some practice to get used to using that terminology? Yeah, it does. Here's the deal though. The terminology is going to be used all through anatomy and all through physiology. And if you're the student who resists it, then you end up missing things that are just straight vocabulary. Not even hard questions, right? Like, even though this is a big, long, wordy question, it's not really very hard if you know the vocabulary. So if the question was, what is the effector for the autonomic motor division of the peripheral nervous system? Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Tons of words, right? But a very simple question, yes? Okay? But you can see how people just get buried in the words and they can't even remember that they actually know the answer to the question. So that's not what I don't want that to happen to you. I want to like get the words out of the way because they're just freaking words. Okay, so there's one little bit of detail that I want to add to this. I'm not going to test over it very deeply because later on we're going to do it in more detail. But the autonomic nervous system has a further subdivision that I'm going to introduce you to once. So I'm going to like blow this up over here just because I'm kind of out of it. Oh, I already did it. Look at that. I'm going to rebuild it up. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system has two branches, and they're both going to go to the same tissue. So let's say we're talking about two sets of wiring to the heart, okay? But I use them under two different circumstances. So I'm going to have two different branches. I'm going to have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But stick with me, they're both going to the same tissue. So what I'm saying is I have two sets of wiring hooked up to the heart. With skeletal muscle, that's not the case. With skeletal muscle, either stimulate it and tell it to contract or just leave it alone, right? But with the heart and with other things, sometimes you need to actively turn up their activity, but sometimes you need to actively turn down their activity. So you actually need to have something that can do both on it, right? It's not just stimulate your heart or leave your heart alone. It's turn it up or turn it down, depending on needs. So here's the deal. The sympathetic nervous system is generally referred to as the fight or flight division. That's oversimplifying. That's not the only time you use it. It's fight or flight and exercise. But I'll give you an example in just a second. And the parasympathetic nervous system, there's a bunch of different ways to refer to it. I refer to it as the feed or breed system. So I want to show you an example of how you would use these in an extreme situation, okay? So the heart is the easiest thing to picture, right, of all of these. So I have two sets of nervous system wiring hooked up to the heart. So let's talk about right now, what's going on with your heart. What's going on right now with your heart is probably you are chilling it out well below its capacity. You are slowing it down actively because you're not very physically active at this moment and you're not particularly stressed out, right? I mean, you don't have a quiz. Your lab practical is not today, right? I'm not calling on you. So you do not need a tremendous amount of cardiovascular activity at this moment. But what I want to tell you is if a tiger walks into the room, an 800-pound Bengal tiger, right? First of all, if they get opposable thumbs, we are all screwed. But second, the tiger walks in, you have entirely different needs for your cardiovascular system, right? I need to actively turn my heart rate up because I'm going to need to either run really fast or try to fight a tiger. You're going to lose, sorry. Or try to fight a tiger. And I need to turn up my heart with a fight or flight situation. So I use what happens in that situation as soon as a tiger walks in and you figure out it's a damn tiger, then your parasympathetic nervous system goes, you got this one, right? And it's out. And the sympathetic nervous system goes, yeah, I got it, and starts turning the heart up. But here's the mistake that people make. People tend to think that the sympathetic nervous system turns everything up. But it doesn't, because in a fight or flight situation with a limited quantity of resources, right? You have 5 liters of blood, you have X amount of oxygen, you have X amount of ATP. Do you really want to do the same thing to, for instance, the smooth muscle in the wall of your uterus? Do you want to, when the tiger walks in, do you want to turn the activity of that up? You don't care about your uterus at that moment. Like, you have never cared less about your uterus, and I would throw it at him if it would get the rest of me away. I'd be like, have it, just take it, I'm out. So what happened in the sympathetic versus parasympathetic situation is it's resource allocation. The sympathetic nervous system turns up the activity of anything that could be potentially helpful. and turns down the activity of everything else. Okay? But specifically only cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. But smooth muscle in some places gets turned up and in other places gets turned down, depending on whether it would be helpful in those locations, right? So the reason I'm giving you that is because so many people make the assumption and consistent mistake all the way through physiology and even into other classes of thinking that the sympathetic nervous system turns every single tissue up. Well, you would get eaten by the tiger if you used up all of your ATP and oxygen very, very quickly by running your smooth muscle of the uterus and the doing glandular secretion of like salivary amylase in your mouth, right? So you're like, that's not going to help. Turn that off, right? Turn the uterus off, turn a bunch of things off, and turn some other things off. That makes sense? Okay, so we will come back to that, and you spend a decent amount of time talking about that in physiology, and it's interesting stuff. Okay, so that is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. We'll come back to that, and then we're just going to briefly introduce you to neurons, and you'll probably we're finished with the hard part of it. This is not really hard. We're finished with the hard part for today anyway. So now we're going to go back to tissue. And now that we know the terminology, we can start looking at tissues and talking about functions and structures simultaneously, right? So we're going to put it back together. So first thing is that what nervous tissue is generally made of is now we know that the gray matter is generally made of neurons and neuroglial cells, and the white matter is the wiring axons between them, right? So we need to talk about neurons. Neurons are really special, interesting cells. The first thing that's really special and interesting about them is that they are hogs. They are oxygen and glucose hogs. They have a very, very high metabolic rate. They gobble up oxygen and they gobble up glucose. In addition, they have almost zero capacity to do anaerobic respiration. What do I mean by anaerobic? You guys remember cellular respiration from 1610, right? What would it mean if it was anaerobic? No oxygen. So what happens with your neurons is if you cut off oxygen for them, they die. Okay? That's why, for instance, cutting off oxygen to the brain, like with a clot or a stroke or a bleed, will kill off that part of their brain tissue. So they have almost zero capacity to make any ATP in the absence of oxygen. In addition, they're also pretty persnickety about their nutrients. They prefer glucose above all other things. And if you don't have adequate amounts of glucose, your brain will get pissed off. And it can sometimes burn other things, but not very readily and not very effectively. So it's super dependent on very, very consistent blood flow, right? Even when you're sleeping. Your brain doesn't use, it uses almost the same quantity of oxygen and ATP when you're sleeping as it does when you're awake. So you need consistent blood flow almost without exception. Okay, the other special things about neurons is that it seems like magic until you take physiology, but a neuron can take almost any kind of stimulus, whether it's pressure, heat, or light, and turn it into an electrical stimulus called an action potential. So they can do that transformation, which is called excitability or irritability. And they're the only cells that can do that. And it's amazing. It actually allows you to take any type of activity and communicate it to your brain or communicate it from your brain. So it's called excitability or irritability. And then the other thing that they can do is they can take and cause that to occur on another cell because they can release neurotransmitters. So they release neurotransmitters to make other neurons send action potentials. So, and that's a lot of physiology. Okay, so the other fascinating and important thing to understand about neurons is that with very few exceptions, and we have found a few, but not significant numbers, they are amitotic after fetal development. They do not go through mitosis, so if you lose them, with very few exceptions, they are gone. So this is really important to talk about with reference to pregnancy, right? Especially with what's going on with Zika virus right now. So let's talk about that and what that has to do with this story. So during a pregnancy, you are building the nervous system throughout almost all 3 trimesters. The nervous system starts to be built about 2 weeks in, and then you're working on it the entire rest of the pregnancy. There are some periods in the pregnancy in which it's really doing a lot of activity, and if you start to damage the cell division during that time with toxins or pathogens, then you can, whatever damage you do to the nervous system is permanent damage. You do not get a second chance. So of course that's important for us here in Utah and here and everywhere in the world, because you want to make sure that you've got adequate nutrition. You don't want to expose yourself to environmental toxins. You don't want to do meth. You don't want to drink a bottle of tequila when you're pregnant. But it's also relevant because there's some pathogens that apparently can impact the development of the nervous system. And it seems as if that's what Zika is doing. For right now, we just have correlation. We don't actually have causation. I don't know if you know that with the Zika virus. So they know that Zika exists in kids with microcephaly, and their mom probably had it, but they do not know if it's the causative agent. But let's just assume that it is. So I don't know if you know this, but 4,000 women in Brazil have had babies with microcephaly, permanent brain damage. And there are more happening all the time. And it seems to be because of exposure to a mosquito-borne pathogen called Zika virus. And it is especially bad when they get exposed during the first trimester, when you have, like, you're putting sort of down the blueprints for how your brain is going to be arranged. And these babies have really small heads and reduced brain capacity and permanent brain damage, although it's a little difficult to figure out how severe it's going to be because they actually haven't started, gotten to the age where they would be talking yet. So that's one of the tragedies. The other part of the tragedy about that is that so many women, and it's mostly in South and Central America, although it's moving other places in the world, and it could potentially move to the US, but if it does, it probably will not get the same hold that it has down there. First off, like, there's a lot of standing water and super duper moist. And one of the big problems and the reason there have been so many births is because birth control is almost unheard of in most of those countries. So if you're pregnant, if you have sex, you pretty much get pregnant, right? It's just like, that's what happens. In addition, the women are having so many babies because in addition to birth control being very, very difficult in a lot of those countries, abortion is illegal in most of those countries. So even if, for instance, 10 weeks in, you knew you had a baby with zero brain, you carry it to term. So it's really been an interesting thing. It's going to hopefully cause some less extreme public debate because we have the capacity to understand experiences that people might be having. Even the Pope, when he visited, just recently visited Mexico, he certainly did not say abortion was okay, but he said maybe birth control is not completely evil. As far as he got. And I was like, well, that's progress, right? Super duper progress. So anyway, so brain development is really important. So you don't get any new ones to speak of, with a few exceptions. That means that they have to last you as long as you last. So your longest lived neurons, and hopefully you'll get to keep most of them, live for 100, 106, 120. I don't know how old. It seems like the oldest person was 124. I have no desire to do that, do you? How lonely would that be? Oh, I used to know her. Oh, she's dead. Oh, I used to know him. Dead. So they have to live as long as you live. Okay, so last little bit is that if you look at a neuron that is wired up to something, you can figure out what it's doing and identify it by function, and then we can identify them by structure. Okay, so do you see this little loop that we're doing right here through the spinal cord? So I want you to imagine that this woman is like feeling an itch, and she's moving her arm because of it, right? She's got some itch. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the neurons based on what they're doing. So this neuron is carrying information toward the central nervous system. So it is what category? It is afferent or sensory. Yes, it is an afferent or sensory neuron. Does that make sense? Okay, afferent or sensory based on what it's doing. And then this neuron, the bottom one, we'll do the middle one in just a second. This neuron is carrying information from the central nervous system out to a muscle to cause contraction, right? You're responding to it. And that muscle is categorized as what? Motor or efferent, right? Okay, you can't tell what it's doing unless you wire it up to something, right? But these are wired up so you can see what they're doing. So this is motor or efferent. So that's two of the functional categories of neurons. You look at it, is it carrying information in? It's sensory or afferent. Is it carrying information out? Motor or efferent. But what about the brain and the spinal cord itself? In the brain and the spinal cord, they're not usually attached to sensory receptors or attached to muscles and glands. They're going neuron to communicate between neurons. So what I mean is, in this figure right here, these in the gray matter, those are not really wired up. Most of them, they're not wired up to muscle. They're communicating neuron to neuron, right? So those are neither sensory nor motor. They are this other category called an interneuron. Does that term make sense to you? Because it's a neuron that's between neurons, right? And so the gray matter of your brain and your spinal cord, does it make sense to you that an awful lot of it is made of interneurons? Not all of it, but an awful lot of it is made of interneurons. Is that okay? Okay, so you can look at an individual neuron and identify it functionally if you've got it wired up to something, right? But now you can also look at an individual neuron and identify it structurally, okay? Because although we usually teach you neurons that look like this, because those are the most common structural category, there's more variation than that in the nervous system. So with neurons, if you're looking at them structurally, there's three possibilities. And it's all based upon how many attachments you have to the cell body, okay? So how many branches you have off of the cell body. So this one has how many branches off of the cell body? Not two. One branch off of the cell body. So this is called a unipolar neuron, one pole, one branch. And this one has how many off of the cell body? Two. That's a bipolar neuron, two branches. And then these down here have more than I want to count. And so those are called multipolar neurons, right? These are the most common structural category. That's why you learned about those before, okay? So now I want to go back to this picture one more time. I'm going to ask you two questions about each of these neurons. I'm going to ask you structural category and functional category about each of these neurons. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so with this neuron right here, okay, first question, what structural category of neuron is? Structural. Not bipolar. It's unipolar. One attachment, yes? Yeah? Uh-huh. Okay, and next question is, what functional category of neuron is it? Based on what it's doing. Afferent or sensory. Yes, that makes sense? Okay, so this one right here. First question, what structural category of neuron is that? Multipolar, do you agree? What functional category of neuron is it? Interneuron. It's between neurons, right? Right, it's functioning between neurons, are you getting it? And then this guy right here, what structural category of neuron is it? Multipolar. What functional category of neuron is it? Efferent, yes. It is efferent or motor. Does that make sense? You didn't run into any bipolar ones here because bipolar ones are the rarest ones in the nervous system. You have them like in the retina of your eye and some other places, but you don't have them in a bunch of different places. Okay, I'm about to let you go, but I'll ask a couple more questions. What structural category of neuron are both of these? Multipolar. What functional category? Well, you can't really see it well enough to determine, can you? Because it's not really wired up to anything. They're probably interneurons because they're in the gray matter of the brain, but you have to hook them to something to know what they're actually doing, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so we are going to stop there for today because that's probably enough information, right? Yeah. I think that's just an anachronism. Like it was called that before we actually used tissues. So I think matter, like that's been around since like the 1600s. They would say that like all of the parts of the body were made of matter, and then this was gray and that was white. So I think that's just a little historical hangover is what it is. I will look it up to make sure, but that's what I think about it.